your story
Sure.
and
Yeah.
yeah, what you've shared in media about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the greater context of this is that Asian Americans in general, or Asian heritage people in general, have been uh, under a surge of just attacks and assaults over the course of this last year, largely due to this pandemic and some of the false narratives that have been associated. And out of people's frustration, a lot of people just lashed out on anybody that looks Asian. I think much of these stories went sort of unheard, just because, as a cultural group, being collectivists, right? As you've mentioned, I'm really glad that you used those labels, because I wasn't sure if I could go that deeply.
To
So,
go there.
yep. So as collectivists, we are sort of taught culturally to be conformists, to not stand out, to keep quiet, to keep our heads down, to work hard, right? Um, so culturally, we're not necessarily a group of people that like to draw attention to ourselves, but in this sort of melting pot of the United States, that oftentimes in the social realms would get us into a position of disadvantage. I've been doing my best to be vocal to get people's awareness around some of these really issues of racism. But what happened 2 weeks ago in Atlanta really triggered a deeper part of my own family history, because there is kind of this deep and painful family secret that is not often talked about in my family, that this incident sort of triggered. And I made the decision to tell this story on social media for the sake of being able to provide a human face to those who were victimized in this atrocity, in such a way that my hope was to honor them, and to help people get a deeper sort of insight into the complexity of how this is not just a random mass shooting. Right. So, long story short, I'm going to give you a quick little spoiler alert here. Is my grandmother. The story is about my grandmother, and it's about my grandmother having spent a season of her life as a sex worker in a massage parlor. So the backstory of that, is that my grandmother was born into poverty, and she had, along with herself, there's 10 siblings, and for whatever reason that we don't know, out of all of her siblings, she's the one child that was sold to be the daughter of another family. And so, for me, thinking about that as a young child, I can just wonder what kind of psychological effect would have on a young girl to always have known your identity from the moment you could kind of remember things, as I was the one that was unwanted by my own family, right? And the tricky part of this is that even though she became the daughter of another family, she still had a relationship with her birth family, so they still grew up knowing each other and all this stuff. So it's pretty messy, right? But when she became of age, she was basically taken in as a mistress, um, by this man who would essentially be my grandfather. But nobody in my family had a relationship with him, because of the fact that my grandmother was taken in as a mistress. So there's a lot of shame around this idea that, my father and his siblings were born out of wedlock. It was an illegitimate marriage. This man was already married, but he still, kind of got together with my grandmother and had 3 kids. Because of all the mess, this man didn't really stick around. So even my own father, as the oldest child, had only seen him a couple times in his life. And from what I know, he died when my father was still very young too. So after that, his family did not really accept my grandmother nor her children as their own, because they were seen basically as illegitimate bastards, of kids born out of wedlock. So very quickly, my grandmother's reality, after living a pretty unstable life, was to find herself now as a single mother, having to figure out how to survive and raise 3 children. Now, culturally, as a woman, and this was in Taiwan, as a woman, culturally, her worth was not valued. So, she never had the opportunity to get an education, and therefore she didn't even learn how to read. So with her limited skills, and her societal status, there was never really any kind of profession that she could get into. So in order to survive, she basically ended up having to sell the only thing she had, which is her body, in order to make money, right? And she did this in the context of working at a massage parlor, and spending days and nights serving strange men who would come looking for sexual favors. And she did this so that her children wouldn't starve. So this is a painful secret, because in a shame-based society, nobody would flaunt a story like that involves having to take on a very shady kind of profession, but it's all for the sake of survival. And and this is a story that my father never spoke of when my grandmother was alive. It was only after she passed away that my dad told my mom, and my mom kept it to herself as well, and she didn't tell me the story until my dad had passed away. So and a lot of people, after hearing this story, have been just encouraging me and saying like, oh, you definitely didn't bring shame to your family, you definitely honored her and things like that. But I think it's even more complex than that. It's easy for a reader to see that and say that, but in my perspective, part of me choosing to tell that story feels a little bit like I'm throwing my dad under the bus, and I'm throwing my grandmother under the bus, because these were lifelong secrets that they didn't want to tell people. But I chose to tell this story because, like I said, I think it gives a face to the humanity that's oftentimes hidden behind curtains. I think as a society, pretty much across different cultures, we kind of have this social, not realizing that many of them are actually doing this um, because of desperation, not realizing that even in choosing to do something like this, it's deeply shameful for them. Not realizing that these women are oftentimes mothers or sisters, they're somebody's daughters, and they're only doing what they have to do in order to take care of family. But too oftentimes we as a society, and I will even say especially as Christians, we only see women like these as morally loose and sexually promiscuous, rather than truly seeing them in light of truly seeing them as human beings that were created with dignity, and seeing them as women whose bodies reflect the very image of God. So that's kind of the reason why I decided to tell that story. And since then, it has kind of exploded unexpectedly. I've never really written anything that's kind of gone viral, and it did. I think it's been a pretty emotional couple of weeks for me, just because it's a lot of publicity for something that took some hesitation for me to write. Is that language to describe what's going on, and move towards a more holistic understanding of humanity and how to love our neighbors well, then so be it.